By 24, he held the youngest philosophy chair in the country. By 34, he walked away from it with his own hand. By 44, his mind was gone completely. And the most famous story about the day it happened, the one you've probably seen in every documentary, never actually happened the way you think. This is the real file on Friedrich Nietzsche, verified line by line. Welcome back to Lone Pride. 5 lessons. Every date checked, every quote sourced, every myth flagged the moment it can't be confirmed. This isn't the Nietzsche printed on a gym poster. This is what actually happened to a man who lost his career, his one shot at love, and finally his own mind, and what he built in the silence between those losses. At 24 years old, the University of Basel appointed Nietzsche professor of classical philology, the youngest man to hold that chair in the university's history, brought in before he'd even finished his formal doctorate. That's where most retellings stop and call it a success story. It isn't. Migraines that lasted for days, eyesight collapsing toward blindness, a digestive system that never fully recovered from dysentery and diphtheria he contracted volunteering as a medical orderly during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Illness historians describe as having permanently wrecked his health. By June 14, 1879, at 34, he resigned, walked out of the title everyone else was still chasing, accepted a small pension, and for the next decade had no fixed address, drifting between Switzerland, Italy, and southern France, chasing climates that wouldn't destroy his body. Most people cling to the room that made them somebody, even after it starts poisoning them. He didn't. A title that's killing you isn't success. It's just a slower funeral with better lighting. Rome, 1882. Nietzsche meets a 21-year-old Russian philosophy student named Lou Salome. He falls hard and has his friend Paul Rie deliver a marriage proposal on his behalf, without knowing Rie had already proposed to her himself. She turns down both men and instead suggests the three of them live together as a kind of celibate intellectual commune. It falls apart. On November 5th in Leipzig, Salome and Rie simply vanish from his life without a word, leaving for Berlin. Days later, Nietzsche writes to his friend Franz Overbeck, "So I really am going into utter solitude." He doesn't chase her. He doesn't perform recovery for an audience. Within months, he starts writing Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the book he would later call his most important work. 6 years later, in 1888, he'd put the underlying idea into one line in Twilight of the Idols. "Out of life's school of war, what does not kill me makes me stronger." Not a slogan for a t-shirt. A conclusion written by a man who had already lost his career, his health, and the one relationship he wanted most. Here's the part almost never mentioned. The fourth and final part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the section people now quote like scripture, was turned down for public release. Nietzsche paid to have it privately printed instead. Only 40 copies existed, and he personally handed out just 7 of them to friends he trusted. The book that would go on to shape 20th century philosophy was, at the moment of its creation, something its own author didn't believe the world was ready for. He wrote around this same period in Daybreak, "I go in solitude so as not to drink out of everybody's cistern." Not solitude as punishment, solitude as a filter, a refusal to let his thinking get diluted by an audience that wasn't there yet anyway. If you're building something right now with zero response, understand that was also the exact condition his most enduring work was born in. January 3rd, 1889, Turin. This is the day it ends, a complete neurological collapse he never recovers from. You've probably heard the story. He sees a horse being whipped in the street, runs over, throws his arms around its neck, sobbing, and collapses. I have to be straight with you. That exact scene has no confirmed eyewitness source. Nietzsche scholars and biographers openly call it apocryphal. It only surfaces in second-hand retellings written years after his death, and by that point, his eyesight was so poor it's questioned whether he could have seen a whip from across a piazza at all. What is documented is colder. In the days after his collapse, Nietzsche wrote a series of disturbed letters. Historians call them the madness letters, to friends including the theologian Franz Overbeck, who traveled to Turin, found him in a state of complete breakdown, and brought him back to Basel. Even his most famous moment turns out to be a story people needed more than a fact they could prove. That should tell you something. The comfortable version of a story spreads. The documented version doesn't need to be beautiful to be true. For the next 11 years, Nietzsche lived under the care first of his mother, then of his sister, until his death on August 25, 1900. He never regained the capacity to understand what he had written. The exact medical cause of his 1889 collapse is still debated by historians today. What isn't debated is this: the man who declared God is dead, who reshaped how the Western world talks about will, meaning, and suffering, spent the final decade of his life unaware that any of it would matter to anyone. He wrote, years before the collapse, in Daybreak, "Solitude makes us tougher towards ourselves and tenderer towards others." He never got to test whether that was true on a wide scale. He just kept writing as if it would be. 5 lessons, a career walked away from at its peak, a rejection that became a masterpiece nobody wanted to publish, a myth about his own ending that turns out to be false, and a solitude that outlived the man who lived inside it by more than a century. He never called any of this a philosophy for the internet. He just refused every single time to dilute himself for an audience that wasn't ready for him yet. If this hit different, you already know where you are. This is Lone Pride.